There. Okay, this hangout on air is live.
Yeah, you're live.
We're live. Okay, we want to thank everybody for coming, for learning both outside of the auditorium of Yeshivat Hakotel, where we just finished a very exciting Chanukah Bayis, a new Beit Midrash. And as we're getting ready for Yom Kippur, there's no better way to inaugurate our Teshuva Lecture series with Rabbi Tarragon. And we want to thank the Rosenbaum family for helping sponsor the ice vanillas for everybody, and that we can get ready for the Koach of Teshuva. I'm sure we're looking forward to an amazing shir by Rabbi Tarragon.
Okay, Shkol to Rav Cutler for all these family shiurim. It's a very exciting opportunity to learn together. And without further ado, let's begin. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Zayin uses a phrase in reference to Teshuva that we find elaborated on in the Gemara in Yoma, which really helps us appreciate the greatness of Teshuva. Gemara Rosh Hashanah Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Gedola Teshuva shemikarat gzar dino shel adam. Teshuva can cause the ripping, the destruction, the annulment of the gzar din of a person. Very interesting term that seems to be part of the bigger picture of a person's onesh, of Teshuva that can avoid the onesh. Gemara asks, how do we know that this is before the Gzar Din, after the Gzar Din? Maybe it's just before the Gzar Din. And the Gemara answers because it says, Vishav virafalo, what's something that needs to be healed? There's a Gzar Din. The Gzar Din needs to be healed, and Teshuva has the capacity of accomplishing that. As I mentioned, this concept is elaborated on in the Gemara in Yoma, which actually starts from this point of refuah. The Gemara, their second source, is Amar Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chanina, Gedola Teshuva shemevia rifut leolam. And I think the chiddush here of this last word that's underlined is that the refuah is not just for the individual who does teshuva, but the teshuva of an individual has the capacity to heal the entire world. We see this idea emphasized in the writings of Rav Kook, the next source, where he writes in Orot Teshuva, Al Yedei Teshuva Hakol Shav Le'Elokut. Through Teshuva, everything returns to godliness. Al Yedei Mitziut Koach HaTeshuva HaSorer Ba'olamim Kulam Shav Hakol U'Mitkasher B'Mitziut HaShleimut HaElokit, etc. Somehow, when individuals do Teshuva, it has the potential of affecting the world in its totality, in its entirety. Moving on to the next image, and I've underlined the Gedola Teshuvas here, because that's the chorus. All these Rabbanim are emphasizing how Teshuva is Gedola. Amar Rabbi Levi, Gedola Teshuva shemagat ad kisei hakavod. Teshuva reaches all the way to God Himself, brings a human being all the way to God Himself. And I think we see this concept. The Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Tzadi Tet, towards the bottom of page 1, Amar Rabbi Yavo, Makom shebalei Teshuva omdin sham, tzadikim einen omdim sham. Balei Teshuva can get to a place that even tzadikim cannot reach. The Rambam elaborates on the great accomplishment that is Teshuva, what Teshuva can accomplish. Bottom of page 1, he says, Gedola Teshuva shemekarevet et ha'adam l'shechina. It brings a person close to the Shechina. And it talks about the third line in bold, the day before, this very same person was hated, viewed with disgust, distance. The person is loved, beloved, close, and a friend with God. And the question is, how can Teshuva have such a great accomplishment? If we continue on page 2, the Rambam in Al Chazayin seems to say the same thing. He says, Kama me'ula ma'ala Teshuva emesh hayazem muvdam alakei Yisrael. How great is Teshuva the day before he was separated from God, and now he's mudbat b'shchina. The natural question is what the chiddush of Al Chazayin is beyond Al Chazayin. I think if you're looking at it carefully, and hope people have a chance to compare this source, in Al Chazayin, the Rambam is adding a dimension to what he said in Al Chavav. In Al Chavav, the Rambam spoke about the personal relationship with God. The sinner is distanced from God. But a person, after he does Teshuva, draws close to God. In Al Chazayin, the Rambam is speaking about a person's ability to petition God, to serve God. And that's why the Rambam explains in Al Chazayin that a sinner, before he does Teshuva, his tefillot are rejected his requests, his mitzvot are torn up in his face. Now, after he does tshuva, the person cries out and is answered right away. He does mitzvot and they're received benacharu b'simcha. V'lo od ela shemitavim lohem. God desires them. So it's not just on the personal level, it's the ability to serve God, to relate to God through tefillah, through Torah, and through mitzvot. Continuing back with that Gemara on page 1, just to complete our learning of the godless of tshuva. Rabbi Yochanan continues and he says, Gedola tshuva shedochet lo taseh shebetorah. Gemara elaborates what lo taseh, tshuva has the ability to supersede. Rabbi Yonatan says, Gedola tshuva shemevia et ha'geula. It ultimately is what brings the geula. One could say for the Jewish people in its entirety. One could talk about for individuals. Fast forwarding for a moment to page 2, where we're up to, the Maharal in his Netivot Olam explains that tshuva's ability to bring the geula is why Yovel, when slaves are freed, when land returns to its original owners, is on Yom Kippur. Because Yovel is about geula, and Yom Kippur is about geula through tshuva as well. Continuing back on page 1 with the Gemara, Reish Lakish says, Gedola tshuva shezdonot nasot lo kishgagot. Averot done b'mezid can be considered like averot done b'shogeg. In fact, Reish Lakish goes even further and says, Gedola tshuva shezdonot nasot lo kischuyot. Things done intentionally can not only become shgagot, but they can even be turned into something positive that a person can build off of. Continuing, Amar Rab Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Gedola tshuva shema'arechet shnotov shel adam. It can lengthen the years of a person's life. Here the Bach has a very interesting girsa. Before the word shnotov, he has the word yamav. Gedola tshuva shema'arechet yamav ushnotov shel adam. And I think what that extra word adds is the connotation that it's not just that a person lives a longer life in years, but a person's years are longer in days. The days of a person's life mean more than a person who hasn't done tshuva. And I think we can see this in the version of the Gemara that we have with the bracket as opposed to the parentheses. Look at the pasuk that's quoted. Shenemar uveshuv Rasha merishato hu yichya. What's the difference? We fast forward again to page 2, bottom of page 2 now. Sefer Yecheskel Perek Yudchet. Pasuk Chaf Aleph says, "V'harasha ki yashuv mikol chatotav asher osa, v'shamar et kol chukotai v'asa mishpat u'tzedakah, chayo yichya v'lo yamut." He'll live and not die. But if you look at Pasuk Chaf Zayin, uveshuv Rasha merishato asher osa v'yas mishpat u'tzedakah, hu et nafsho yechayeh. That has a different connotation, and that's the pasuk, by the way, that the Gemara is quoting according to the bracketed version of Veshuv Rashi Mishra. Hu yechayeh et nafsho. It's not just that he lives a long life; he gives life to his soul, as the Maritz Chayot says in that Gemara, looking right under the psukim we just read. Hainu she'anefesh asher machtzavta mimakom kadosh. The soul that's hewn from a holy location. Tichye biyofya v'hadara k'mikedem. It lives, it's brought alive in its beauty and splendor as it once was. Tshuva has the ability not just to lengthen the life of a person, but to add to the quality of a person's days. Last but not least, if you go back to the Gemara now says, Tanya, it's not only the Amoraim who spoke about the godless of Tshuva. Haya Rabbi Meir Omer, Gedola Tshuva, shebishvil yachid shasa Tshuva, mochlin l'chol ha'olam kulo. Because of the tshuva of one person, it can bring the forgiveness of the entire world. The Rambam built off this formulation in a very beautiful way. Bottom of page 2, Perek Gimel Halacha Daled. The Rambam says, a person needs to see himself and the whole world as half zakai and half chayev, as lying in the balance, as dependent on his one decision, his life and that of the whole world. He does one chet, he can destroy the whole world. In one mitzvah, he can swing the balance towards positivity. Based on the words we just saw of Rabbi Meir, that Gedola Tshuva shebishvil yachid she'asa Tshuva, mochlin l'chol ha'olam kulo. If we continue with the Rambam, as we just saw on page 2, we continue with the Rambam's words on page 3. we can see how the Rambam built off this idea of the power of a person's actions in tshuva on a personal level as well. We all know the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Tet Zayin Amud Bet, which speaks about how the 3 books are opened on Rosh Hashanah: Tzadikim Gemurim, Shayim Gemurim, and the Beinonim. Beinonim, of course, are left in the balance during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. Depends on whether they're Zocha or not in their actions in those days. Gemara says, first source, page 3, Beinonim Kluyim V'omdim Mi Rosh Hashanah Ve'ad Yom Kippurim, Zachu Nichtavim L'chaim, Lo Zachu Nichtavim L'mita. Most people translate Zachu means you did one extra mitzvah. Lo Zachu means you did one extra Avera. Let's look at how the Rambam understands Zachu versus Lo Zachu. The Rambam writes, Perikim Halacha Gimel Halacha right before, HaBeinoni Tolen Oto Ad Yom Kippurim, Im Asa Tshuva Nechtan L'chaim, V'im Lav Nechtan L'misa. The Mishnah first in the Rambam, that the Zachu has to be by positive action, not just by doing a mitzvah, but of doing tshuva. And if the person doesn't do tshuva, but also doesn't do anything wrong, that in and of itself is damning. And the Mishnah explains that during this period, the expectation is that a person takes responsibility of fixing themselves. And if they don't, that in and of itself can determine a person's fate. The greatness of tshuva also generates an expectation that a person take advantage of the opportunity. And if a person doesn't, that in and of itself is of great significance. So the question is, how does tshuva have this great power? Such a great power. What is it that leads to these tremendous results? So we continue now to Od Bet on page 3, the tochen, the content of tshuva. The Gemara in Yom Daf Pevav Amud Aleph tells us what the result of tshuva needs to be. Hechidami about tshuva. Rabbi Yehuda says that he has the same opportunity to do the Aveira he had in the past. One time, a second time, and he doesn't fall for it. He's changed in a way that he no longer repeats the same mistakes. Rabbi Yehuda sharpened this by saying, the same woman, in the same time, the same feelings in the same place. Not just roughly similar, but the exact same scenario with the exact same draw in which he made a mistake, he's able to pull back and not make that mistake. And whatever the chait is, and whatever the delinquency is, whatever our weakness is, we're able to control ourselves the next time. If we have a weakness for iced coffee, so this time, no matter how thirsty we are, no matter how good it looks, we're able to hold back. Not from drinking white iced coffee, but mamish when there was brown iced coffee. The good kind of iced coffee, the coffee iced coffee. And we're there and we're thirsty and it was hot and mamish and we're suffering through learning and we have iced coffee. But we don't go for it. We're able to, keep ourselves from the calories. That's how the Gemara defines it. And the Rambam, true to the Gemara's form, Perek Pet Halacha Aleph says, Eizohi tshuva gemura. What is complete tshuva? Zeh shabal yadu davar she'avabo. Where it happens that you had the opportunity. Efshar b'yad la'asoto, and he had the opportunity to do it. Ufirish v'lo asam ipnei hatshuva. Lo miyira v'lo mikishalom. He doesn't hold himself back for any other reason but the fact that he's done tshuva. The Rambam in Halacha Bet now talks about not the result, but the process. Because most people are not going to find themselves in the exact same situation. So, how do we know that we've done it? Rambam says, "Umahi hatshuva, sheyazav hachotel cheto." He should abandon the sin. Yasiru mi'achshavto. He should remove it from his mind. V'yigmor balibo shelo yaseh od. He should banish the possibility of sin from his consciousness. It's no longer a possibility for him. He's totally abandoned it. He's committed to no longer doing it again. To the point where v'yoyid alav yodea ta'alumot. God, the one who knows secrets, knows shelo yoshev lezeh achet la'olam. Even if a person does not encounter the same scenario, God is able to see that he's changed. Very interesting translation of this for the Rambam. And now, the question I would like to ask on this is, let's say the person has really changed. Let's say the person will never do it again, and God is his witness. Why should that make a difference? Person did a crime. Person deserves to be punished. Who cares that he'll no longer do it again? In fact, the Rambam's words 2 halachot later are even more perplexing. Halacha Daled. The Rambam continues, Midarke atshuva liot hashav tzoek tamid lefnei Hashem bebechi v'tachnunim. He should be crying all the time over his mistakes. Okay, if a person really feels bad, they'll be crying about that. I understand. V'oset tzedakah k'fi kolcho. He gives tzedakah as much as he can. I also understand that. You want to see if a Jew is serious about something, see if he's willing to pay. Okay. U'mitrachek harbe min hadavar shechata bo. I understand. U'mishan ishmo, and he changes his name. He changed his name and says, that's not me who did that. What is this, the witness protection program? That's not me. What is it, quick fix? You change your name, you got a from name now, and so you're not the person who did that? Like, why does this make a difference? What are we not understanding about tshuva? But one thing is for sure, the questions I'm asking about tshuva are good questions. Or at least some questions about tshuva are good questions. Because Chazal saw tshuva as something that was a tremendous chiddush. Something that didn't make natural sense. Something we needed God to be mechadesh, and without whom we would not have a possibility of it. That's what I'd like to look together with you now at Od Gimel. Tehillim Perek Chafei, it says, Tov Yashar Hashem, Al Kain Yorech Hatoyim Baderech. God is good and straight, so he shows sinners the way. What does it mean he shows sinners the way? Yerushalmi explains that the Midah of Chachma, second source from the bottom of page 3, was asked, what should be the onesh of a sinner? The answer given was, Chatoyim Tiradef Ra. Sin should be pursued by negative and suffering. The natural result of doing the wrong things is that a person's life is full of suffering. Okay, Shalul Nevuah. The attribute of Nevuah was asked, Chote Ma'al Onsho. What should be the onesh of someone who sins? Amr lehen hanefesh achotati tamut. The sinner should die. That's indeed what we find throughout Tanakh. That's what should be happening. In fact, if we look at the next source for a second, the Nefesh HaChaim, he explains that anyone, continuing on page 4, who assumes that God will just pass over sin like it's not a big deal, is punished very severely. Because just like, he explains, the nature of a person is that if he eats something unhealthy, he will suffer, even if he regrets it later. The bottom line is he'll suffer the consequence. A person who eats unhealthy food, a person who eats poison, he could regret it, but it's not going to matter. So too, a person who sins, ultimately, they have damaged themselves. Tshuva makes no sense. That's why the end of the Gemara is so important. Going back to the Yerushalmi, bottom of page 3, after they asked Chachma Nevuah what the fate of a sinner should be, and the answer was clear: suffering. God himself was asked, Chote Ma'al Onsho. Amar lehen Ya'aseh tshuva v'yizkaper lo. God is asked, and God gives the answer of tshuva. It's an answer we needed God to give because it doesn't make sense on its own. And that's why we say in the Slichot right after Rosh Hashanah on Tzom Gedalia, second source, page 4, Horeita derech tshuva lebata shovevach. You showed the path of tshuva to your errant daughter, to the Jewish people, because without God, we would not have known it on our own. And that's why the Shari Tshuva Rabbeinu Yonah explains that tshuva is min hatovot asher heitiv Hashem yitbarach in bruav. It's one of the great favors that God has done with his creations. Ke'echin lehem haderech la'alot mitoch pchat ma'asehem v'lanus mipach pishehem. Without it, we wouldn't know it, and we wouldn't have it. But the question is, how does it make any sense? As Rabbi Yosef Albo asks in his Sefer HaIkarim, the tshuva is a real suffix to understand. After the Avera was done, why should the regret make a difference? If we understand the severity of sin, maybe we don't understand the severity of sin, so it's easy for us to think that tshuva should make a difference. But if we understand the severity of sin, if bin Laden would have been brought in front of a court, he would have said he regretted it. He would pass a lie detector test that he really does regret it and will never do it again. They would still punish him. So why do we somehow take this seriously? And interestingly, Chazal saw this as a matter of discussion between the first two sinners, Adam and Cain. As we know, Cain in Bereshit Perek Daled, God punishes him for killing his brother and says, Nov and Nod tiyeh ba'aretz, you're going to be a wanderer forever. Pasuk Gimel, Cain responds and says, Gadol avoni min so, this is too great for me to bear. I'm going to be killed and hunted wherever I go. So God reduced his sentence, gave him a sign to protect him. Maybe Pasuk Tetzayin, it says Cain settled there, it's Nod. Maybe settling there was somehow a lesser fulfillment of Nov and Nod tiyeh ba'aretz. The Medrash tells us, Vayetze Cain Yotei Hashem, it says in Pasuk Tetzayin. Cain left God. What does he mean by Yetze? It says Kegonev das al Yonah, as if he had gotten away with murder, literally. And it says he met Adam Arishon, and Adam said, hey, what'd you get for what you did? He said, Asiti tshuva v'nit pasharti. I did tshuva and we met halfway. Adam HaRishon said, hit himself in the face. Oh, kachi kocha shel tshuva v'ani lo yiti yodea. Tshuva has so much great potential and I didn't realize it. Why didn't Adam realize it? I think the answer is very simple. Bereshit Perek Gimel, when God asked man how he knew that he was naked, man finally admits, Pasuk Yud Bet, Adam, vayomer Adam, ha'isha shenatati imadi, hi natna li min ha'etz va'ochel. She gave me from the tree and I ate. The word ochel is forward tense, future tense. Not ve'achalti, but ve'ochel. Now the vav in Hebrew has the ability to switch from future to past or past to future. So ve'ochel can mean I ate. Why is it formulated in future tense? So the Medrash says, Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, ve'achalti ein ktiv kan ela ve'ochel. Achalti ve'ochel. I did it and I'll continue doing it. What does he mean? So Tzaddik HaKohen explains, moving on to page 5, that Adam HaRishon did not seek the possibility of tshuva, did not believe in the possibility of tshuva, because he realized that he wasn't going to be able to change. He realized that just like he sinned this time, he would come to sin again next time. He realized exactly the question we're speaking about. Tshuva makes no sense. So on the one hand, as we've seen, tshuva has a great impact. On the other hand, it's hard to understand why it should have any impact. So I'd like to do two things. Number one, I'd like to understand what the basis is technically. And then number two, understand why that basis is significant. Let's begin by understanding the basis that Chazal saw in tshuva. And I think the beginning of this is Chazal's comment, very famous comment on one of the first people who God looked at passionately, even though, not passionately, but mercifully, even though they didn't seem to deserve it. Bereshit Perek Chaf Aleph. God hears the voice of Yishmael crying from thirst. As it says, Yomerla, God said to her, Ma lo chagar, what's wrong? Al tiri, don't be afraid. Ki shama Elokim et kol anar b'asher hu sham. God has heard the voice of the child as he is there. What does that mean, as he is there? Gemara Rosh Hashanah says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Ein danin et adam ela lefi ma'asav shelo tasha'a. God judges us only based upon who we are at that moment. Now that momentous view of man, I think, is in contrast both to the future and the past. Let's begin with the future. Rashi explains the deeper thing, the deeper story going on around this pasuk. It says that the Malachim Yeshar said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, why save this father of the future Arabs? Of Daesh, right, of ISIS. Think how much death and destruction his grandchildren are going to bring to the world. And God said, I judge b'asher hu sham, and not based upon what somebody does in the future. The Rush summarizes it this way, talking about the Midas Harachim of Hashem. Even though God knows that we will sin again, he judges us b'asher hu sham as we are right now. That's one aspect of the great mercy of tshuva. But there's a second aspect as well, and that the chinuch develops. The chinuch explains, b'asher hu sham teaches, that God judges us based upon what we are at the moment, and not based upon what we have been up to that moment. The Yerushalmi develops this idea. It asks, it says, no, God doesn't care what's going to happen in the future. And then it comes back and says, God also doesn't care about what has happened in the past. Last line on page 5. Im zach v'yashar hayita. God speaks to Eov. You can see the circle on page 6. Ein ktiv kan hayita. Ele im zach v'yashar ata. It doesn't depend on whether you were pure in the past. It depends on whether you're pure right now. Top of page 6. The friends say to Eov, Im banecha chatulo. If they sin, vayishalchem b'yad pishtam, that's why God punished them. Pasuk vav, Im zach v'yashar ata. If you're pure now, ata yoyer alecha v'shilam etem vatzitkach. Now God will fix your suffering and rebuild your world. And that, of course, is the basis of the very shocking, famous Gemara in Kedushin Daf Memtet, where a person who's a known Rasha says to a woman, I am suggesting that I marry you on the condition that I'm a tzaddik. Even a complete Rasha, the Kedushin works, Shemahira Tshuva B'dato. Maybe at that moment, he had in mind and committed himself to change his path. The moment changes his identity. And of course, along these lines and more at length, the very famous story in Avodah Zarah Daf Yud Zayin of Rabbi Lazar ben Dordaya, who was a baseful, really baseless person who pursued every prostitute in the world. And suddenly one of them was able to inspire him to do tshuva. And he looked around the world and tried to get others to intervene on his behalf. And when he finally realized that it was up to him, he put his head between his knees and started crying until he cried himself to death. And a bat kol came out and said, Rebbe Elazar ben Dordaya mezuman l'chai olam haba. He is right into olam haba. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's response to this was, he cried and said, some people have to work their whole lives to accomplish what they become. And some people accomplish it in one moment. Not just that he should get into olam haba, that he should be called Rebbe. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. It was a lifelong effort to be called Rebbe. And this guy, one moment, because God views us based upon who we actually and genuinely are at that moment. And the question is why? What we've done is we've gotten a definition of what. The question is why. I think the answer we can find, begin finding, in the writings of Rabbi Yosef Albo. We saw his question before in the Sefer HaIkarim. Why should regret make a difference? You should be punished for what you did. Rabbi Yosef Albo on the bottom of page 6, moving on to page 7, gives a very lengthy answer that, because of the late hour, we won't read through, but I'll summarize for you, and of course you have it here and you can read through at your leisure. Rabbi Yosef Albo says, people do all kinds of things in their lives. The question is, which things do they really stand behind? Or in other words, which things really stand for who we are? If we take an extreme example of a person forced to do something, a person takes your hand and punches someone else with it. You did punch someone else, but it's not your free will. Now, what about where we do it on our own? Someone holds a gun to our head. We're doing it on our own force, but we're under duress. What about situations where we do things because we have no choice? Not a gun, and we can keep going through a spectrum. Now, people do make mistakes because of the inclinations that drive them. Which actions really stand for who we are? We all know about the concept of hatarat nedarim, where a person made a commitment, they come along and say, I didn't really mean it. Had I fully understood, I wouldn't have said it. And then the words become meaningless. Why? Because he doesn't fully stand behind them. Because it's not what a person stands for. And I think on a deeper level, and you can read through this piece of the Sefer HaIkarim if you want to see how he elaborates on this concept. But on a deeper level, we can see this in the Gemara in Brachos, Daf Samach Aleph. The end of that Gemara, and everybody knows I like to talk about this Gemara, Rava there says, Kegon anu beinonim. People like us are beinonim. Abaye was so shocked, he responded to Rava and he said, Lo shavik mar chaya l'chol beria. You haven't left us any space for our own survival, because if you're a Benoni, we are all in big trouble. Because Rava was not a big tzaddik, he was a big tzaddik. Rava, the Gemara says, learned Torah every second, every moment, to the point where the Satan couldn't kill him, till he managed to distract him for a moment. How could Rava have thought he was a Benoni? Why is that great Gedolim cry on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Clearly, Rav Nevin saw is more good than bad, no? So the explanation given by many is the Gemara right before this. Right before this, the Gemara defines Rasha, Tzaddik, and Benoni not based on the scorecard result, but based on what motivates people. A Tzaddik is a person driven only by the motivation to serve God. A Rasha is a person driven only by the motivation to rebel against God. A Benoni is someone who the Gemara says, Zev zeh shofta. He's driven by both emotions. Even great tzaddikim are still driven by both emotions. Their identity is unclear. Even if all their actions are in one direction, on the inside their identity is unclear. And that is what tshuva is about. Tshuva is about a person clarifying, for expressing and forging a clear identity of life, not the inconclusive dualities that we often live with. And I think this is why, if we look at number 3, the very famous Parsha of Tshuva, Devarim Perek Lamed, Psukim Aleph and Bet, it describes how man does Tshuva. In Pasuk Gimel, it describes how God responds with his own Tshuva by bringing us back to Israel, which is why the return of the Jewish people to Israel is so significant. But if you look at Psukim Aleph and Bet, where the Tshuva of man is described, Only in Pasuk Bet, stage 2, do we get to the return to God. V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha. In Pasuk Aleph, stage 1, it's v'hashevota and the reflexive el levavecha. Teshuva is meant to and must begin with a person returning to their own heart. Because if a person does not relate to this very difficult aspect of ourselves, if a person does not dissect their identity and clarify it, they've accomplished nothing. And this focus on the heart, Pasuk Vav, if we have a chance, we'll get to later, the stages of Teshuva after our God brings us back to Eretz Yisrael, a later stage, Pasuk Vav, Umol Hashem Elokecha levavcha v'et levav zarecha le'avat Hashem Elokecha v'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha. God helps us change into people able to serve Him completely. We may want to. We may strive for that. But God has to be the one to help us accomplish that. With the conclusion, Pasuk Yud being, we'll listen to the voice of God, keeping His mitzvot. This is, I think, part of the reason the Ramban saw the next 4 psukim, which talk about the nondescript mitzvah as being not above you and not beyond you, but very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart to do it. Ramban famously says the mitzvah being referred to here is tshuva. A lot of the basis, I think, is the fact that it's described as being bilvavcha, because that's where it needs to start. The Gemara in Eruvin Daf Nun Daled, it's a very interesting way of relating to this Gemara. I'm not going to go through the whole Gemara there. Just the end, Rabbi Yitzchak says that the interpretation of Ki karov elecha davar ma'od beficha u'bilvavcha la'asato is Eimatai karov elecha, when is it close to you? Bizman shebeficha u'bilvavcha la'asato, meaning it's not always close to you. It seems to imply that tshuva can be far from you. It can be far from you. It's close to you when you approach it through beficha u'bilvavcha. First, Lubavitcher Rebbe, in his sefer that became known as Sefer Atanya, he called Sifran Shel Beinonim. We look at page 8. In the introductory shara, on the first page, he says, this Sefer Likutei Amorim, which I'm calling Sifran Shel Beinonim, collected from the great writings of the great rabbis, on the pasuk Kikaro ve'lecha davar ma'od beficha levavcha la'asoto, says the Rebbe, Leva'er hetev, to explain well, Eichu karov ma'od, how is it very close? B'derech aruka uktsara, in a long, short way. And as I explained in Rosh Hashanah, I believe that the Rebbe here is basing himself on the Gemara in Eruvin Daf Nun Gimel Amud Bet, which I think he saw not coincidentally appears in Amud before the Gemara we saw on the bottom of page 7, which talks about when is it close to you, when it's befichul bilvavcha. The Gemara that tells the story about Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, who was once walking on the way to a city, and he got to a crossroads, fork in the road, and he saw a little boy there, and he asked him, which way do I get to the city? And the boy said, this is the long, short way, and this is the short, long way. Which way would we go? Yeshua ben Chananya went on the short, long way, and he says, I got to the city very quickly, it was short. When I got there, I saw they were doing construction, I had to turn around. I went back to the boy, I said, you told me it was a short way. He said, I told you it was the short, long way. It's short, you get there very quickly, but it's long because you don't actually get there. Yeshua ben Chananya said, I kissed him on the head and said, Ashreichem Yisrael shekulchem chachamim gedolim. I don't know if we would have kissed the boy in the head. Most of us read this story, we're like, cute, right? The Rebbe saw depth here. And he said the moral of the story is that sometimes shortcuts are a lot longer than we realize. And sometimes the short way really begins with the long way. And the short way of tshuva is the longer way of having to open ourselves up. It might be quicker to change your name in an outward way, grow your hair or shave your head, or whatever it is, to feel firmer, but tshuva that's real has to begin in the innards. And I think this is why the significance and the result of tshuva includes literally the recreation of human beings. Human beings being able to get a really fresh start. In Tehillim Parakuf Bet, it says, Tikatev zot ledor acharon ve'am nivra yahalelka. A created people will praise God. What does that mean, a created people? Medrash asks, is there another nation that's going to be created? So, Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Shimon suggests the days of Mordechai, but the Rabbanan say These are the generations that are like dead in their actions. And they come and daven in front of Hashem on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and God recreates them as new beings, understandably on the day when the world is recreated. In Rosh Hashanah in particular, Bamidbar Perek Chav Chet and Chav Tet, where it talks about the Karbanos Musaf, each Yom Tov it says, V'kravtem ola l'reich nichoach. On Rosh Hashanah Perek Chav Tet Pasuk Bet it says, V'asitem ola l'reich nichoach. The Yerushalmi learns from here that if a person goes through the process of Rosh Hashanah properly, it's as if nivreitem bria chadasha. And this is why, in a very incisive way, the Medrash darshans that famous pasuk about Rosh Hashanah. Tik'u v'chodesh shofar, v'keseh liyom chagenu. Keseh liyom chagenu, the chag in which the moon is covered, Rosh Hashanah. What is tik'u v'chodesh shofar? Look at the second paragraph. B'chodesh zeh tichadshu ma'asechem. B'shofar, b'chodesh hazeh shipru ma'asechem. Shofar means l'shaper, to better your actions. Chodesh means l'chadesh, to renew your actions. The only way bettering oneself is real is if it's rooted in recreating oneself. If the paint we apply is applied on top of the old coats, without scratching off the old coat and removing the things that are problematic, we haven't really improved ourselves. We've just put a thin layer of paint that will cover over the problems for a short amount of time. Teshuva is where God judges us by who we are. And who we are is rooted in the ability for us to truly clarify that and recreate ourselves in the process. And this is why the Nevi'im spoke about the Lev Chadash and the Ruach Chadashah that accompanies Teshuva. Continuing on page 9, the Medrash darshans this and says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgives us each year, particularly on Yom Kippur, by the way. Mechadesh libam liyirato. He renews their heart in a way that it can fear God. This is not just the result of Teshuva. This needs to be part of the process of Teshuva. Rabbeinu Yonah, after his Sefer Shari Teshuva, he has a little addendum called the Yesod HaTeshuva. And he quotes these psukim from Yecheskel, and he says, it's essential when a person does Teshuva to throw all the chatayim behind them and make himself into a person who is as if he is born that day with no history. Zeh Yom Tchilat Ma'asav, paraphrasing the pasuk from Rosh Hashanah. Let's look at the second paragraph, where I begin with the underline. V'derech zo tivieno lashuv b'tshuva shlema. This way will bring someone to return with complete tshuva. Ki hu ya'asa atzmo k'mashlech me'alav koved ha'avonot v'otzem ha'chatoim asher asa v'lo yavhiluhu ra'ayonotav v'lo yinichu lashuv ki yavu shmichatav. Most people don't do complete tshuva because they don't believe that complete tshuva is possible. Even if they disagree with other Barishon, and they believe people can change, they believe that at least they carry their past with them. And even if I'm changing for the future, I remain a person scarred by that past, identified by that past. Says Rabbeinu Yonah based on Yecheskel, tshuva is the belief, the recognition, and the process of totally disconnecting from whatever in our past we should disconnect from. Cook writes this in his own way. Yesod haTeshuva tzarech liolam liot munach ala tikun shel haba. Teshuva has to be about fixing tomorrow, because we can't fix the past. And if we're focused on fixing the past, we'll never move forward to the future. We have to disavow the past. We have to totally separate from that past. But we have to be moving forward into the future. And I think, as I mentioned briefly, and as we'll speak about more at length on Yom Kippur, but I'll speak about briefly now, that is that next level of tshuva. Let's go back for a second to the psukim that we saw on page 7. Remember, we saw that tshuva begins with v'hashevot el levavecha. A person returns to their heart. We're looking at number 3 on page 7, Dvarim Perek Lamed. And then pasuk bet v'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha. And then in recognition of this, God returns to us and shows this return in pasuk Gimel by returning us to Him. And He brings us back to Eretz Yisrael. But the tshuva process isn't complete, which is an important understanding for our reality in living in Israel. On the one hand, living in Israel is very significant. On the other hand, it does not imply that the tshuva process is complete. Pasuk Vav. We need u'mal Hashem Elokecha lebavcha v'et levav zarecha. God has to give a bris milah to our heart, an interesting imagery. The Ramban explains, continuing, moving forward on page 9, The Ramban says that our vashevota levavecha is our making a clear decision about who we want to be. That decision, though, can't change our hearts. We're not heart surgeons. If and when we make a decision about what we want to be, God, if we connect to it enough and commit ourselves to it enough, can actually turn us into that. To a point where we make natural decisions based upon the Ratzon Hashem as opposed to the duality we naturally find inside ourselves. And this is how the Mesilat Yesharim explains very famous Gemara on the bottom of page 9 in Yom Daf Lamed Chet, where it talks about how a person who comes to purify himself will be helped by God, or in more specific detail, Adam Mekadesh Atzmo Me'at, person sanctifies himself a bit, Mekachin Oto Harbe. Milmata, a person does them down here, Mekachin Oto Milamala. Mesilat Yesharim on page 10 explains, we have to begin the effort, and God rewards us with the completion of the process. Person cannot change their natural makeup, but they can decide what to pursue, and God makes that change. And this is why, ultimately, tshuva is not about finding some new artificial external identity. It's in essence about returning to our natural state, to how we were initially created. Because as it says in Kohelet Perek Zayin, Nevad re'ei zeh matzati asher asai Elokim et ha'adam yashar. God made man straight. V'hema bikshu cheshbonot rabim. But man looked for ways to outsmart the system. Rashi explains, Adam HaRishon was made straight. Man, through his thinking that he could outsmart God, that's where sin came from. Tshuva is returning to that natural state, to that original state. Ramban talks about it in the context in Milas Halev, as we saw earlier. Ramban, on Bereshit Perek Bet, talks about how a person in his teva is created to do the right thing with that moral compass. He just confuses himself with the Eitz Hadat over Tshuva. It's about refinding that moral compass. And to conclude, Tshuva, as we'll talk about in Yom Kippur, is called Tara, and its idyllic climax. As we say in Yom Kippur, Ki b'yom hazeh yichaper lechem l'tara etchem mikol chatotechem lefnei Hashem titaru, as the Mishnah elaborates in Yoma, lefnei mi atem mitarin, mi mitar etchem. Ultimately, tshuva, on a deeper level, is about the purification of heart, the purification of identity. The v'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha is a natural outgrowth of that, because inside each and every one of us is a soul that God infused within us already from our creation, as it says in Bereshit Perek Bet. God created us from the dirt, but vayipach bi'achbav nishmat chaim. God himself blew into us a soul, and whatever it consists of, it comes from God blowing it within us. Tshuva is about not having to find within our soul something unnatural and external, but reconnecting to the true base of our soul. And in fact, Rav Kook writes, second source on the bottom of page 11, when a person forgets the real makeup of their independent soul, when they get distracted from focusing on the internal meaning of their life, everything becomes blurry and confusing. The beginning of tshuva is sheyashuv ha'adam el atzmo. Person returns to his real essence, el shoresh nishmato. Umiyad yeshuv el ha'elohim el nishmat kol nishamo. And automatically, immediately, when returning to oneself, one returns to God, who is the neshama of all neshamot. Any other approach, he says, any way of trying to return to God without one returning to their true self, is a tshuva of remiyah, which is using God's name in vain. Tshuva is about reappreciating what we say every morning. Elokai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. The neshama we've been given is pure. It's been created and infused within us by God himself, who maintains it within us. And the recognition of this should help us relate to him properly. Tshuva is about waking up in the morning better than we were the day before, because we believe we can be something better, and we know what that better person is meant to be, that original form of ourselves. No better way to conclude a shir about the power of tshuva, that has so much power if it's just done correctly by connecting to our internal selves, than by chazering these words with a little tune. Elokai, Neshama shenatata bi tehoroi. Elokai, Neshama shenatata bi tehoroi. Ato virata, ato yitzarito. Ato nafachto bi, v'ato misham rovikiri. Oy ato v'rato, ato yitzarito. Ato nafachto bi, v'ato misham rovikiri. Ay, ay, koziman, shani shama v'kirvi, koziman. Ay, shani shama v'kirvi, ay, moidan. Ay, moidan, lefanecha, Hashem, Elokai, avotai, ribon. Ay, ay, koziman, shani shama v'kirvi, koziman. Ay, shani shama v'kirvi, ay. Ay, vaydani lefanecha Hashem, Elokai, avotai, ribon kol ha'masim. Mitzvah Hashem. So we get tomorrow, we should take better advantage of.